People are going to lose their minds. This is a moment in history unlike anything humanity's gone through. It's a very different world for humans to come.
Take a step back and see the broad picture, which is the way all these technologies are interlinked.
Because this is all about exponentiality, and humans can't think in exponential terms.
How consequential do you want to say machine intelligence is? It's almost certainly as consequential as writing. How long did writing take to disseminate through the human population? Hundreds, thousands of years. And we're dealing with it now on a scale of months.
But in this kind of world, you're compounding 100% growth every year, and the numbers become astronomical.
AI is going to spot patterns in the world that were just completely invisible to us.
Even if you think that the AI and the robots are your demise, you might as well bloody invest in them and make some money out of it. If not, you're just going to be angry man shaking your fists at the clouds.
One of the largest recipient nations of World Bank funding was China. And I thought, wait, this is the number 2 economy in the world. Why are they getting this borderline free money?
All right. Well, welcome to the Real Vision Live Talks. This is Kyle Bass with Hayman Capital and my good friend, Erik Bethel with Interval Ventures. We're going to introduce you to someone, I only come on and talk on Real Vision when I think there's someone worth talking to. And I have just a couple of those people in the next few months. Erik is one of the key players. He's one of the key organizers of patriotic groups of, let's say, thought leaders in America that think about national security from both sides of the aisle. And I wanted you to understand who he is, where he comes from, and how he got to where he's sitting here today. So first of all, welcome, Erik. I'm glad to be here with you. Second of all, if you don't mind, Erik, tell us a little bit about where you grew up, what your kind of founding principles were as a child, as a family, and then how you got to exactly where you're sitting here today. And then we'll jump right into the World Bank first. But if you would give us a brief history.
Let me think through this. Talking through my life, I don't often do this, so I've got to think through foundational principles. I think I would probably start with my family background. Mm-hmm. My mother is an immigrant from Cuba. My father died when I was very young. My father was American. And my mother was a single mom who raised me in Miami, mainly in blue-collar, lower middle-class neighborhoods where people only spoke Spanish. You look at me and you look at my name and you say, whoa, wait, who is this guy? What do you mean he's Cuban? And so my dad was American, right? And so you sort of roll the dice, and genetically I look like my dad. But I grew up in lower middle class Cuban American neighborhoods, and I think foundational principle number 1 is we fled communism, and I'm so grateful to the United States for bringing in my mom, who was an asylum seeker, and my family, and I'm so grateful for the fact that this country gave me the opportunity to excel. And there are those that believe that the United States is an oppressive country, but I take the exact opposite view. It is because of the American dream that I am who I am. So that's foundational principle number 1. And through, I guess, hard work, competence, risk-taking, and so forth, anybody can make it here. Whether you are, whether it's Barack Obama, who is a son of an immigrant as well, or me, right? And so foundational principle number 2 is I went to the Naval Academy, and that informed my, I guess, created a sense of discipline and purpose that I carry today. And I'm very proud to have been a member of the Navy and, continue to try and serve in various capacities, whether it's at the World Bank or as ambassador to Panama or in other ways. So that's a little bit of context.
Hey, sorry to interrupt again. It's Raoul here from Real Vision. I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel, get the notifications. We have so many incredible conversations with so many amazing people. It will really help you in your financial journey and your journey to understand just what the hell's going on in this world. Anyway, click subscribe, get the notifications, and enjoy.
Yeah, well, one of the other things at some point in your life also you found, and you've kind of fell into this idea that you actually have a duty in a place in this world to think about the vulnerabilities of the United States and the vulnerabilities as they relate specifically to China. You spent almost 10 years living in China. You speak fluent Spanish, you speak fluent Chinese and English. You and I have been friends for a while now. Tell us more about what drew you to China in the first place. Well, I've asked you before, when did you have the Sputnik moment where you realized that that you were actually that China wasn't everything that they thought they were? A kind of writ large, Xi Jinping and his administration, or even the administrations that predated him, the leaderships there, and what took you there? How did you exit? And now you and I are on potentially the same very focused hawkish page on China, but I think you started out on the other side.
Yeah, it was on the other side. I started my career when I left the Navy at Morgan Stanley, and then after graduate school, business school, I went to JP Morgan. And I think I was at let me back up. I'd spent pretty much all of my career doing emerging markets, Latin America work. They said, "Hey, Erik, you speak Spanish. You're in the Latin America group." And I was invited to the JP Morgan Beijing conference. I'm trying to date myself, but I think it was 04, 05, something like that, maybe earlier, 03. And I expected to see Mexico City or Sao Paulo levels of development in Asia, right? And when I arrived in China, I said, "Holy mackerel, what is going on here?" And I thought, I went to, this place has got it going on. Something is going on here. People are working 24/7. There's a sense of optimism. China's on a rocket ship and it's going places. And I happened to meet a number of folks at this Beijing conference with whom I stayed in touch. And one day I got an offer to come work for a firm called ChinaVest, which was the first private equity fund established by an American guy, a super, super interesting guy, whose name was Bob Thelin, who started a PE fund in China in 1983, if you can believe that.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, I got to get to know this guy. And over time, we developed a friendship. One day, he invited me to work for him in Shanghai. At the time, I recently gotten married, 2 years before. My wife was pregnant with her first child, and I said, "Hey, honey, let's move to Shanghai." And she said, but ultimately, somehow I prevailed and we moved to China. And so while I was there, I have to say, I've done a lot of difficult things in my life, right? I've worked 100-hour weeks on Wall Street. I was a plebe at the Naval Academy. I've gone through, a lot of difficulty, but moving to China with a new baby, new job, new language, new everything. Right. And China's not like going to, say, London, certainly, or even Paris. It's completely different. And so I have to say it was a very, very difficult adjustment initially. But while I was there, I was awestruck by what I saw. There was so much going on in China. It was so interesting. It was so different. And I thought China's going to develop along the same glide path as South Korea or Japan, just 10 times bigger, right? And so I was very much on the other side initially. And I stayed there. I tried to prolong my time there. I ultimately started a fund, my own fund. I then sold it to a division of Franklin Templeton. But while I was there, I started noticing an inflection point, right? I saw the pendulum was moving a little bit slowly towards, in China generally, with respect to America, sort of antagonistic. And I started watching that happen in slow motion.
And Erik, was that like ethno-nationalism bubbling up, or was that just pure combative negotiations with other side? Like, what do you mean exactly as you saw that pendulum moving? So I'm curious.
think it's a combination of things. There is a sense of ethno-nationalism, and that's been inculcated in the schooling from day one, right? And
Yes.
I think that the popular narrative in China is that, we, China, were once ahead of the world in everything. We were the most sophisticated, the most advanced, the highest GDP in the world. And then through a series of unfortunate events at, sort of the mid to late Qing dynasty, we made some bad decisions. And those bad decisions and foreign intervention caused us to lose our place at the top of the food chain. And I think they've said to themselves, look, it's been a bad, couple centuries for us, but we're on our way back up, and it's inevitable, right? We are smarter, better. We have a 5,000-year history. Now it's our turn. So when I first got to China, it was really very welcoming toward foreigners, especially Americans. In fact, here's an interesting thing: if you're a teacher, an English teacher, okay, in China, you got paid more money if you spoke with an American accent compared to a British accent, which I thought was interesting because we are the current empire, they were the past empire. And so I think there was this really good feeling toward the United States. And it was, we want to emulate you, we want to be like you. But of course, ultimately, we will be better than you because we are better than you. That was kind of the sense I got. And then once you hit that pendulum, once it went past, a certain degree, then we got on the other side of that. And then Xi Jinping came into office, and then he weaponized all of that angst that had been felt for a very long time. And by then, China was strong enough to be able to have its own way.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I find most interesting about you is you have put yourself strategically in a few places where I think, and I'm sure you thought and think that you could really make a difference in combating some of the asymmetries that we've afforded to the Chinese, and especially your position as the executive director of the World Bank. We're actually speaking to the Honorable Erik Bethel, so I would love to, unless you're behind the wheel of a golf cart late at night, but we won't go there. Let's talk about the World Bank, and specifically what you saw at the World Bank and what you did, and what I mean by what you saw, all of the vulnerabilities you observed where China was really, let's say, creating new positions within the bank, where they were sending teams of people to understand things like ICSID. Take me through what you saw at the World Bank and how you operated there.
Sure. Well, let's first of all let's provide some context so that you and others, you certainly understand it, but others listening, what is the World Bank? Because a lot of people have heard of it, but they don't really quite know what it is. So the World Bank was an institution that was created by the United States to, in effect, rebuild Europe. It was sort of part of this broader Marshall Plan. In fact, the first loan that the World Bank did was to rebuild France. It was, I want to say $100 million or so. Ultimately, as Europe was rebuilt, the World Bank repurposed itself to involve itself in the developing world with the idea of getting people out of poverty, okay? Which is a great and it's a noble mission, while maintaining shared prosperity, which means if we're going to deploy capital to countries, shared prosperity means the elites don't get all the lion's share of the World Bank money and go to Switzerland with it. So it's a great mission. It's a noble mission founded by the United States. The United States still has a majority of the shareholding of the World Bank. And so people actually listen to the executive director, not because I'm, particularly, well-dressed or well-spoken, but because the U.S. is still a very important stakeholder.
Yeah. Can I add one thing to that?
Sure.
About the foundation of the World Bank? You have at Bretton Woods, 1944, post-World War II, you had a scenario where they formed both the World Bank and the IMF. And number one, it was to bring the world's poor out of poverty. But I think maybe even foundationally, typically what happens when big wars happen, both sides deficit spend going into a war. Yeah. And the back end of the war, to the victor go the spoils, and to the loser goes defeat, default, and hyperinflation, as we saw in World War I, World War II with Germany. So, really, IMF and World Bank, I think, were set up to also be optical backstops to the world, so that you don't have these massive currency runs and things where everyone thinks the world's coming to an end financially. So I agree, but I think foundationally they were also set to be a big, broad, optical foundation for the financial world.
Yeah, I think you're right. And ask yourself, how does the World Bank deploy billions of dollars to countries that have very low credit ratings, right? So if you are, South Africa, and you go to, I'm not to highlight one country in particular, but if you're an emerging economy and you go to the market, your borrowing costs are what, LIBOR plus 900, if not, well, these days even more. And so how is it possible that the World Bank has a AAA rated credit and yet is loaning money to the emerging markets at LIBOR plus 100, and so, or less in many cases, and that's because we, the United States Treasury, backstops the World Bank. I won't get into the details of and the nuances of how it's done, the callable capital and so forth, but we're on the hook for quite a lot of the loans that the World Bank deploys.
Well, we commit our entire credit rating. The entire financial strength of the United States is committed to the World Bank. So World Bank bonds trade just like U.S. Treasury bonds because they're backed by the U.S. Treasury and the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, along with other governments, but it's our government that gives them the credit rating.
That's right. Now, while I was there, this may have changed. World Bank bonds were at LIBOR minus. LIBOR minus, I think, 15 basis points. So, wow, how does that happen? Because they're seen as kind of a sure thing. And so yeah, that was the origin, the origin story of the World Bank. It's a noble institution. It's got, I don't know, I want to say 15,000 employees plus another 12,000 consultants, right? The joke is that they're solving poverty one employee at a time.
And there's also a fun fact about if you're a World Bank employee in the United States, what are the tax implications of being a World Bank employee?
Well, look, the executive director, I can assure you, has to pay taxes.
Oh, I understand. I was not directing this at you.
No, I know, but many of the World Bank employees, foreign and otherwise, don't pay taxes, and the executive director gets paid half. The U.S. executive director gets paid half of what everybody else does. It's a congressional statute of sorts. So
you weren't there. You weren't there to get rich.
Oh no, on the contrary, I lost quite a lot of money between flying to and from DC, which I paid on my own, and paying a hefty tax bill, and buying an apartment in Washington. So this is a labor of love. It really was. And so
let's get into your labor. What did you see? And how did it metastasize while you were there?
Yeah, so day one, I opened up my Lenovo laptop and I said, wait, look, why am I using a Lenovo laptop? This is kind of strange. Lenovo, Chinese company known for backdoors. And I said, I'd like to meet the CTO of the bank. And she was a very nice lady, and with, interestingly enough, ties to China. Well, that's interesting. I later learned that China, years before I got there, had lobbied quite substantially to get Lenovo laptops in there. But let's table that for a second. So as I mentioned, the World Bank's job is to get people out of poverty. So it came as quite a surprise to me that one of the largest recipient nations of World Bank funding was China. And I thought, wait, this is the number 2 economy in the world. Why are they getting this borderline free money, right? And if you think that money is fungible, and it is, right? China can take the billions of dollars that they're getting from the bank at very low rates of interest, and they can redeploy that to other countries at higher rates of interest, right? They can,
I don't know. Maybe through the Belt and Road program. Call me crazy.
maybe through the Belt and Road program, right?
So there is a world where you could connect some dots where you say the U.S. gave our credit rating to China, they borrowed the money from the World Bank, and then relent it out to impose their authoritarianism around the world through the Belt and Road program.
That's right. And then you can compound that. You can say it's not just what the money represents; it's what the money gets you. It represents, as opposed to just getting the money itself, because it's, in the grand scheme of things, $4, $5, $6 billion is irrelevant when you're talking in the trillions, which is what China's GDP is. But it's really what it represents. And what does it represent? It tells the world that you are a developing economy. And if you're a developing economy, you get favorable treatment at the World Trade Organization and a whole host of, let's call it, offspring of the United Nations. Take, for example, the Universal Postage Union. What the heck is that, right? I didn't even know what it was.
Yeah.
And so this is the international body that sets postage rates around the world. And so if you are a developed country, right, you put money into it. And if you're a developing country, you get money out of it. And so what it does is it effectively subsidizes your postage rates around the world, such that if Alibaba sends packages to the United States, it's a lot cheaper than somebody from Seattle sending something to, Miami.
Yeah.
And so we are.
This was at the exact same time that they were running and potentially winning the quantum computer race, circumventing the globe with hypersonic weapons, and running a giant space program, and yet they were developing.
That's right.
So I just wanted to make sure I got that straight.
Nailed it. And so what happens? The World Bank, through our backstop, loans money around the world. Some of it goes to China, and obviously not all of it, but at the time it was a lion's share. Now, to be clear, and I want to be very clear on this, I think our government has been very wise. I spearheaded a project to try and tell people that this was ridiculous. And over time, the quantum of that money has substantially reduced, but it's still there. Money is still going to China. And the IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, had been deploying billions of dollars to Chinese companies. So, for example, somebody came to me with a project that said, hey, there's this optical chip company that goes on drones that the IFC wants to invest in. And I said, well, China has the second largest pool of venture capital in the world. Why do they need IFC money? And they said, well, if the IFC is involved, it's going to look a little less benign, a little more benign and a little less, problematic, because, maybe China is seen as being problematic. And I said, wait, you want us to finance a Chinese optical sensor company going on drones so that China can spy on people, but use the face of the World Bank to hide behind? I mean, these are the kinds of things I saw, which were absolutely ridiculous.
Well, you say ridiculous, and yet they happen every day.
Sure. It's hidden in plain sight. Yeah.
Before we get lost on something or past this, one of the stats that you and I discussed even back then was China was the second largest recipient of loans at the World Bank for the last decade, which A, is crazy, but B, is just a fact. But something even more interesting, of all World Bank lending to all places like Nairobi, Kenya, and to all of the places that you visited as the executive director of the World Bank looking over these loans, what percentage of all World Bank lending for construction projects in various countries around the world did Chinese construction companies have the contracts for?
Yeah, look, I don't have the current stats in front of me, but when I got to the bank, I was astounded. The Commerce Department, the World Bank has a little mini embassy, right? And the folks that worked for me included folks from Commerce, from Treasury, from State, USAID, and so forth. And my team came to me and said, hey, look, at the time, China was winning a ballpark 38% of World Bank procurement contracts. We were winning something like 0.6%. And so, wait, we're giving money to China for them to loan money around the world. They, in turn, were giving money to Kenya. Kenya wants to build a bridge or a hospital or a school. China
or,
wins.
or a railway. I mean,
Yeah. Well, the Kenya Railway is a the Kenya Railway is a
I just
very.
want to take you to the right place. I mean, every now and then we have to keep you on the tracks.
Well, what happened? I mean, if you want to go down the rabbit hole of the Kenya Railway, they used to have an ancient British railway that would literally get, it would go off the rails every, once a week. And the IFC and others spent, hundreds of millions of dollars rebuilding that. And one day it stopped. And then the Kenyans went with the Chinese standard gauge railway. They're now in debt to the tune of, $3 to $4 billion, which they can't pay back. And there had been a lot of speculation that the port of Nairobi was the fine print in their loan agreements. We've seen this before in Hambantota, we've seen it in Djibouti, we've seen it in lots of other places.
Yep. Back, I know it sounds like non sequiturs, but on specifically on the Kenyan deal, when you flew there and you landed at the airport and you drove to the palace. You learned so many interesting things on that one trip.
In Kenya or Uganda? Because
Uganda.
I've been to both. And both lovely countries. Look, in the case of Uganda, the airport was done by China Communications Construction, right? So it's like a big welcome sign. Welcome to Entebbe Airport, courtesy of CCCC. Which, of course, you expect because, 3/4 of airports now are being built by the Chinese in the developing world. But then you get in the car and you drive to the hotel. Entebbe is far away from Kampala, well, relatively far away. And you drive down the highway and you say, wow, this is an interesting highway. And the driver says, oh, yeah, this is the Chinese toll road. And I said, the Chinese toll road? First of all, where's the toll booth? Oh, I don't know. Well, wait, how do you pay for this? Oh, I don't know. Anyway, and then, later you meet the finance minister and you say, hey, when do you have to start paying for this Chinese toll road? He goes, what do you mean pay? And so you get into these discussions and then you realize that they owe China hundreds of millions of dollars. In the case of Uganda, it's all in between the dams, the roads, et cetera, et cetera. It gets into the billions, and Uganda can't pay this back. And so, wait, the World Bank, my taxpayers, have to give money to certain countries so that they can pay back the Chinese. Meanwhile, the Chinese are also getting money from the World Bank, so they're winning, in two ways. Oh, and they're also winning the procurement contract, so they're winning three ways, right? At the expense of my taxpayers. This is wrong. And so when you asked earlier, did I have a Sputnik moment? I think when the scales fell from my eyes, so to speak, when I started seeing this happen, not just in one or two, but many, many countries around the world. And I started seeing the tentacles of China, right, wrapping themselves, around countries and strangling them. And it's wrong.
Yep. Well, I think, again, at the World Bank, you had a supranational institution that the world tends to have a lot of faith in the past, just like the WTO, just like the WHO, just like the IMF, right? And what China has figured out how to do is infiltrate and manipulate the majority of the supranational institutions in the world. You have a particular lens into the World Bank. If you would share with us, who ran HR at the World Bank? And were there any new positions created there while you were there, or maybe just prior to you being there, that had senior roles? And who ran the Treasury, where roughly $7 trillion a year ran through? I'm just curious to know who ran all those things at the World Bank.
Yeah, so, HR specifically was run by, at the time, right? It's changed. At the time, it was run by a fellow from Africa. The number two was from PRC China. HR reported into a managing director position who was a person from China. That individual also ran the budget. He's still there, right? Ran the budget, ran HR, ran IT, et cetera. The treasurer of the World Bank, and you nailed it. You've got the numbers: $7 trillion from China. The previous head of the IFC, he left, thankfully, as I was arriving. He was also Chinese, who was pushing the IFC to work with Chinese state-owned enterprises around the world. But even the president of the World Bank, a fellow by the name of Jim Kim, was traveling around the world, meeting with financial and world leaders, promoting the Chinese Belt and Road. This is an American, right? This is an American president of the World Bank who is working with Xi Jinping. In fact, there are photos of Jim and Xi Jinping in Beijing with their arms in the air, talking about how they're going to promote Belt and Road. Now, again, I'm dating myself. This is going back to 2019 or so, 2018, 2019.
I know, an entire 4 years ago. It was so long ago. I know what to do. And Jim Kim, and he ended up kind of having a rough ending too. What happened to him?
He one day he decided he was going to leave the bank very abruptly. No one knew exactly why, and he ended up working for GIP, which is a large infrastructure private equity fund. I think $50 billion fund, where he took this former Chinese IFC guy with him, and they both worked there under the presumption that they would help raise money for Belt and Road. And so I thought, man, this is an American president of the World Bank who curries favor with a foreign nation to in turn jump to the private sector and enrich himself to help China. Yeah. I don't get it. Maybe I'm wrong, right? I'll preface this and say maybe I'm misreading things, but it just didn't sit right with me.
Yeah. All the stories that you told me all along the way, to this day, it's hard to digest them all. Sometimes fiction is stranger than fact, and I wish that were the case here, but maybe it isn't. Post World Bank, let's talk about where you saw at the end of your role there, and as you were the nominee to be the U.S. ambassador to Panama when January 6th happened, and that ended up killing that nomination, however, or stopping the process, for whatever you want to say.
The fact that President Trump didn't win the election, it has nothing to do with January 6th. So okay. I was asked to serve as the ambassador to Panama in 2019, and as you know, it takes forever to go through a Senate confirmation.
Yeah.
And along the way, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. And let's just say the Senate was preoccupied with a lot of other things, not necessarily ambassadorial candidates. Although I would argue that Panama is a place where we need to spend a lot more time, and we need to really pay attention to what's going on in Panama, because I would argue that aside from Mexico, it's the most important country in Latin America.
No doubt about it.
I went through my confirmation, both for the World Bank, was Senate confirmed, and obviously being an ambassador. My World Bank, I was 100-0, so I was seen as non-controversial, and I'm not, right. I'm a professional who loves his country. I'm not unduly partisan in one way or the other. And in the case of Panama, I made it through my committee meeting without any problem, and I was getting ready to for a floor vote on the Senate, and President Trump lost the election. So it is what, right?
Got it. Well, I didn't mean to get hung up there. Truthfully, I was just saying politics ended up killing something that I thought was so vital and necessary to our country, which is putting you in the seat in Panama, where, call it 40% of U.S. container traffic in trade, call it $300 billion, rolls through that canal every year, 6% of global trade. Yeah. It's a real problem. The Chinese government and Chinese companies have bought up and brought in charm offensives to both sides of the canal, and it's a real problem.
So, yeah, I mean, let's Panama is important because it's obviously a logistics hub, right? Where unfortunately China has a container presence on both sides of the canal. Um, China is also involved with building what's known as the fourth bridge, right? They're building another bridge across the canal where it is rumored that potentially sensing equipment that can see into our ships is being placed. They tried buying a piece of land at the mouth of the canal for their embassy where they can basically see everything. They've bribed any politician with a pulse, particularly folks in the Varela administration, including President Varela himself. But not only is that important, but also Panama is a financial hub as well. Let's call it financial logistics hub.
Yep.
Where whether it's the the Panama Papers or shell companies or whatever it's very important to understand how the international criminal community can leverage Panama, not just from logistics, but also from a financial perspective. And let's also not forget that through the
through the politics, right? I mean, they can get to the politicians.
Yeah. So China, not just in Panama, but around the world, has been very influential in getting people when they're city council members, right? And having them become friends of China. And it can be done through lots of different ways, right? Influence operations, taking them to Beijing, paying for their trips, to outright bribery or honey traps or whatever. But the final thing I was going to mention with respect to Panama is that through the Darien Gap, which is that very narrow part of the southern part of the country that borders Colombia,
yep.
You've got a lot of people traversing the Darien Gap and coming through to the United States. And so Panama is really important, and we need to pay a lot of attention to it.
Yeah, and there's the good news is there's been a lot of focus on that gap. It's roughly 30 miles wide, about 100 miles long. If you're actually traveling through Central America on your way to the U.S. or to the U.S. border, you have to run through the Darien Gap. So it's basically a choke point. It's a little wider than Xerxes choke point at Thermopylae, but you get the drift.
Right.
You and I recently, let's go ahead and move now to the physical side of things. You and I recently spent a day on the border trying to understand what these special interest aliens that are coming here, again, we're not interested that day. We weren't interested in Mexicans or Central Americans per se. We're more interested in countries that might be state sponsors of terror or countries that are deemed to be our single largest national security threat, which is China, according to the Director of National Intelligence. You and I went down there just to try to understand the mayhem at the border. What was your key takeaway from our helicopter trip and our driving around with CBP and Texas DPS?
I had a lot of takeaways. The first is that they've intercepted 350 million fatal doses of fentanyl in the last 18 months. That's more than the population of the United States, right? We've got
that's super interesting. And by the way, fatal doses, not just doses.
And that's what they've intercepted. Imagine what's come through. I think the other takeaway I got was there seems to be a battle going on between CBP and Texas law enforcement. So Texas law enforcement is trying to put barbed wire or containers or whatever, and Customs and Border Patrol is opening up the gates to allow folks to come in.
They actually cut the wire.
Right. I don't understand. I don't understand what's going on. I think what the Trump administration did with respect to immigration policy was really smart. The Remain in Mexico policy was, if you're an asylum seeker, you wait in Mexico, you wait your turn, and you spend your time there. And I think the Biden administration, when they reversed all of that, they want immigrants to be processed in the United States. So what happens is Customs and Border Patrol will pluck you out of whatever the Rio Grande or wherever you are, process you, give you papers, and they ask you to come back for a court hearing. But because the immigration courts are so full, it's 4 years between, now and the time you'll get your hearing. And I think what the statistics are, the 10 or 15%.
No, 3% come back. 3%. Yeah.
Yeah, look, and don't get me wrong. I'm very sympathetic as the son of, asylum seeking Cuban, mom. I'm very sympathetic to immigrants. And I'm also like a human with a heart who lives on earth, who cares about people. And when you see, moms and little girls or whatever coming across the border, your heart, reaches out to them. And so I want to distinguish, what you mentioned earlier with the other side, which is 50,000 people coming in from countries that are state sponsors of terror. But what is that, right? And how is it possible that this is happening? I think they've caught something like 270 or 300 real terrorists.
Yeah.
And then there is the scary notion that thousands of military-aged Chinese males are coming across the border.
Yeah, 2,000 a month.
And so my takeaway was, if I were Chinese and I wanted to escape China or find economic opportunity in the United States, I would get a visa. I would fly from Beijing to Los Angeles and overstay my visa and sort of disappear. Now, I don't condone this, but this is, option A. Option B is I'm going to fly from Beijing to, I don't know, San Salvador, and then I'm going to pay, what's the going rate for human trafficking? $25,000?
20 to 30K a person.
So I'm going to fly from Beijing to San Salvador, and then I'm going to pay 30 grand to get across the border.
Yeah.
Why would I do that? Right? So it defies economic and just common sense, unless you didn't want to get caught.
Or you don't want to be known to the U.S. authorities. I mean, my key takeaway was, man, it's a lot of extra work and a lot of extra money to walk across or swim across or do whatever you want to do at the border, as opposed to just landing in the U.S. and overstaying your visa. However, when you land here, we'll have you on facial recognition. And one other thing that people need to know is we always just merge Customs and Border Patrol. Customs has a blue stripe, and those are the people that we all see when we go into the airports. They're very advanced, and they will turn you away, and they will ask you questions if you end up in one of the U.S. airports. Border Patrol is a green stripe. They don't have facial rec running around on the border. They do at the processing centers to a certain extent, but let's just say Border Patrol is a much more rudimentary force, and they get orders from the operating administration, whichever one it is, trying to stay political here. But the current administration, if people swim across, it doesn't matter if they're 20 military-age males with no kids and no wives. They will cut the razor wire and welcome them into our country and interview them, ask them their name if they have no documents, which frequently they have no documents, and then we release them on their own recognizance. And Eric, you and I actually followed a bus to a let's say a border processing station that was private, and they told us that everyone that was there was going to buy a plane ticket, and that the next bus was taking them to the San Antonio airport, where they were going to fly to wherever they wanted to fly to. I found that to be, A, that can't possibly be true that they all buy plane tickets to go where they're going. And B, you and I inspected their documents. Were those photo ID documents? No, they were white pieces of paper with whatever name they had given to Border Patrol, written on them. And those documents got them on an airplane at San Antonio airport. And flew them to wherever they wanted to be. Prior to this trip that Eric and I took to the border with the Texas State Police, we FOIA'd CBP to find out how many of these special interest aliens. Eric had mentioned 50,000. These aliens, again, are deemed to be from countries that have, or in the past might have, sponsored terrorists. The numbers are, we've processed, caught, and released 538 Syrians in the last 2 years, 139 Yemenis, 659 Iranians, 6,400 Afghanis, 13,000 Uzbeks, and 30,830 Turks. So we've got, when I add up all those numbers, that's 70,000, and then you add 2,000 a month from China. We've got 100,000 people here, 100 to 120,000 people here that we better have our eyes on, that I'm afraid we don't have our eyes on at all. And that was the worst part of the takeaway from me.
Yeah, look, I think immigration policy is something we could probably spend, the next rest of the day talking about. I won't go into it other than a few points. Number one is, yes, we are a nation of immigrants. I am a product of immigration. I think the litmus test for people coming to America is that you want to live the American dream, right? You do seek economic opportunity. I think we should probably open the aperture for legal immigration. I think we should be, sympathetic and compassionate. However, we also need some kind of a border to make sure that we know who's coming in. And so whether it's drugs or potential saboteurs, we need to know who's coming in. So let's be sensible about it. And unfortunately, both sides have politicized this to the point where right now we're just inaction is where we are. And you have 8 million people that have come across in the last 2 years. That's bigger than 35 states or something in population. It's bigger than the entire population of Honduras. So let's just figure out how to do this sensibly and compassionately.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out, we need a border structure. You want to call it a wall, a fence, whatever you want to call it. We need to have one. And then we need to have a very pro-immigrant policy. But our policy, we've got 335, 350 million people here in America. There's 7.7 billion people that would love an alternative place to live, or some large fraction of them. And it is the road to perdition if in fact we leave open borders. And we're about to learn so. So we're going to spend the last 10, 15 minutes of this conversation, Erik, talking. We try to make these timeless, but let's talk about the fact that we have invited Xi Jinping himself to come to San Francisco this week. Today's Monday. He'll be here Wednesday. Let's talk about what you think the rationale is for the invitation. B, if you were the president, would you be inviting Xi Jinping here? And C, what do you think the Biden administration's key takeaways, what deliverables are they hoping for? And as you know, on these kind of big state visits, they've already agreed to whatever they're going to agree to before he lands here. What do you think those things are?
Well, let's understand where we are and understand where China is. Let's begin with China, right? I think since Xi Jinping took over, when I lived in China, the Chinese Communist Party was seen as sort of an afterthought. Most young people in China, most entrepreneurs, most aspiring individuals did not really care to join the Chinese Communist Party. They wanted to be Jack Ma. They wanted to be billionaires, right? So I think when Xi Jinping came in, he said, hey, wait, this is a threat to the private sector writ large, is a threat to the existence of the CCP. And he went out on let's call it a purge of corruption, which turned into a purge of his enemies, which turned into a purge of the private sector. And now, whether it's through golden shares or whether it's through the disappearance of key and high level entrepreneurs and business leaders, China's
and military leaders.
And military leaders. You had the Rocket Force and so on and so forth.
Remember that Central Military Commission? I don't know. Call me crazy. They're disappearing like flies.
Yeah, and senior leaders of the Politburo. What's interesting? It's caused such a tremendous amount of fear in China that everyone is in a period of stasis. Right? Nobody really wants to do anything, and as a consequence, China's economy is decelerating. When the government tentacles, right, involve themselves in every aspect of business, well, the incentive structure is to do whatever the government wants. And so inefficient state-owned enterprises can get loans from the government at 3%. But if you're in the private sector, it's 15% or whatever the number is, 10%. And so this stasis, right, has resulted in everyone is frozen and they're not quite sure what to do. right? Because their incentive system is no longer to make as much money as possible for their shareholders. Their incentive is to do whatever the government wants. Compound that with massive debts, whether it's Country Garden or what have you. You have a massive debt overhang in China. You have a great degree of distrust and lack of popularity of China globally, and you have a lot of headwinds. So, what does Xi Jinping do in this scenario? You saber rattle. You become increasingly more bellicose. You start attacking Philippine resupply ships in Second Thomas Shoal, and this could spiral out of control. Now, from the part of Washington, I think, look, I'm speculating. What do I know? But I suspect that business leaders have reached out, and Wall Street leaders have reached out to Janet Yellen and Gina Raimondo and others and have said, hey, look, you guys are taking this way too far, this anti-China thing. So tone it down. And I think that there is the perception, both in the international community, in our business community, in think tanks, in the intelligentsia writ large, that we were hurtling toward war. And I think that the administration has said, look, let's tone things down. In my opinion, I think it's nice to think that way. But when you signal weakness from a cultural standpoint, right? China views all of this as, oh, they're acknowledging that we are superior, right? They're kowtowing to us. They send this parade of, Janet Yellen, then Tony Blinken, then Gina Raimondo, John Kerry. They've sent all of these people.
We actually led with John Kerry. We led with our climate minister to re-engage the climate criminals of the world, which is China. So I think it's important to note that our path of appeasers led with our climate czar, which that the climate's important, but at this time where we sit at a hinge in history, you shouldn't be leading with your climate person.
Well, even if you are all in on climate, and look, I live in Florida, I live on the water, I'm very concerned about the climate, as I'm sure most people are, certainly you are. But there's a great degree of intellectual dishonesty when you consider the fact that China is a primarily coal-fired electricity generating country. And so you take coal and you burn it to make electricity that then makes solar panels. Then we buy the solar panels and we were like, oh, we're so good, right?
Eric, China builds a full-scale coal-fired power plant
a week.
Every 3 days. Every 3 days. They're 67% of their power to this day comes from coal. Dirty, nasty, strip-mined coal.
And let's add to this intellectual dishonesty. 80% or 90% of the photovoltaic material that goes into solar panels comes from Xinjiang, and a lot of it is made by slave factories of ethnic Uyghur minorities. Yeah. So let that sink in, right? We're talking about ethnic Muslim minorities in China in slave factories in subhuman conditions to make photovoltaic material for the solar industry, right? And so we're being put in this strange position as the United States. What do we care more for, human rights or climate? And so China's boxed us in. And then you add to that, all right, let's assume that solar and wind powers everything, right? Well, what do we do about base power? What do we do about battery storage? Well, as it turns out that the lithium, the battery grade lithium is pretty much 70% processed in China. The spherical graphite that for the anodes is 99%, maybe 100% in China.
It makes China the world's super OPEC, if in fact we go there.
Exactly. They're Saudi Arabia plus the UAE plus, combined. And so how do we allow that? And so, yes, we're all interested in climate change, but how do we get more of that to be done in this country, right?
Let's go back to the Xi takeaway. So we lead with climate, we lead with appeasement, we lead with weakness, and we beg him for meetings, and then we beg him to come to the United States. Would you be inviting him here to the United States? And we've got about 5 minutes left. What do you think the takeaway will be here?
So if it were me, I would go to some neutral place, not the United States, not China. I would go somewhere else. Maybe Taiwan. But no,
Okay.
kidding aside, let's think of a place where we would go in neutral territory. What I find really interesting about the APEC visit is that San Francisco, which once had an intractable homeless problem, has cleaned up the streets. The streets are now pristine, and 20,000 homeless have vanished overnight. And so you say to yourself, wait, how does that happen? And so we're willing to clean up the streets of San Francisco for the Chinese Communist Party's dictator, but not for the citizens of the city, not for the American people? What does that say? And then furthermore, Gavin Newsom, I think, is going to play a very prominent role in this APEC discussion. And he was just in China saying that California was going to be the strongest partner for China. And yet, 6 months earlier, they found an illegal bioweapons lab in California with neurotoxins and all sorts of dangerous substances, which and just a short, 30, 40 miles away from the base where we train F-18 pilots. And so again, is this willful ignorance? I don't know. Now, what's going to come of this? I don't know. I think that if I were the United States, I would ask for a few things. The first is a commitment that China stop stealing intellectual property, a real commitment, not just words. I would ask for a complete de-escalation of the South China Sea, leave the Filipinos alone. The Filipinos have these little island outposts where they have fishermen and a few military officers, and they're trying to resupply them with food. And China is shooting lasers at these lasers in the eyes of these Filipino, resupply vessels. Stop. No.
Yeah.
No.
Well, Google Scarborough Shoal or Thomas Shoal.
Yes, Thomas Shoal.
This program, and look at the linear distance between the Philippines and their number one source of protein, which happens to be fish, on those shoals, and the proximity of those shoals to China. It is insane what the global bully is doing.
Right. I would also ask that China completely cease hostile activities in Taiwan's airspace. Since Nancy Pelosi's visit, and by the way, while I'm not of the same political party, I was very happy to see her go to Taiwan, because what it did was it unmasked China in many respects. And China since then has flown hundreds of sorties in Taiwan's exclusive air zone. They've done countless military operations. Stop. Just completely stop. I would ask for the suspension of all forced labor programs in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs that I mentioned earlier. I would ask that they ban all fentanyl shipments from China. When we talked about fentanyl earlier, you forgot to mention that 99% of it comes from China, right? Stop. And so these are some of the commitments that I would ask for. And what China is asking us for is that we don't talk about human rights. We don't talk about Taiwan. We reopen trade. We stop the sanctions on semiconductors, right? Well, no.
Yeah, I particularly love their screaming and crying about our sanctions on semiconductors at the same time that they're saying we can do this all ourselves. We don't need America. We came with the Huawei, Mate 60 Pro, and we have our own 7-nanometer chip. And that they continue to scream about being having the chip sanctions on them. I mean, again, their duplicity knows no boundaries. But I think it's important to think about any of the deals that we've agreed to with them in the past, and the fact that Xi Jinping himself stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, United States of America, and said to President Obama, in no uncertain terms, that he would never militarize the South China Sea. Well, Google the Mischief Reef. Google Subi Reef. Google any of these things, and actually use Google Maps and zoom in. They're 10,000-foot runways with missile batteries, fighters, and bombers, and they are giant military bases. And they told us they would never do it. And that's one of the reasons we allowed them to ascend to the WTO. It's one of the reasons we allowed them to keep developing status. I mean, we can only go through trying to kick this football with Lucy pulling it away from us every time we try to kick the football. One day we're going to learn that they're not to be trusted. And to your point, it's crazy that we cleaned up San Francisco for a dictatorial, authoritarian, genocidal, communistic ruler. It is insane. Oh, by the way, we haven't mentioned here, a limitless partnership with Vladimir Putin, the world's #1 war criminal, today. So it's pretty crazy that we have him setting foot in our country. Of course, it's in a city that I have personally witnessed more Chinese flags, multiples more Chinese flags than American flags flying in San Francisco.
Yeah, look, there are a lot of ways to take this. In our industry, whether you're a private equity or a hedge fund manager, there's this thing called track record, right? And frankly, China's track record of being honest is they're batting zero on that. And so I think the world is shaping into an axis of countries that really don't like the United States and want us to go down for different reasons. China and Russia have a limitless partnership. China is supplying the Russians with drones and drone chips and has refrained from doing so in Ukraine. But if you want to take this to the Middle East, you've got Hamas, which is backed by Iran, which is a proxy for the Russians, and Russia is China's junior partner. It's hard for me to imagine that the chain of events that transpired wasn't somehow known by all of those parties in Israel.
Well, China buys all of Iran's oil, so they send them $210 to $240 million a day. So, yeah. I mean, again, whether there's fungibility in capital or whether there are business partnerships that enable heinous terrorist acts to happen, China supplies the blood to the tumor of Hamas every single day. Absolutely.
And by the way, do you know where the spare parts for the quadcopter drones come from? Alibaba.
Come on.
No joke. So look, the big picture point is, I believe in trust but verify. I believe in having a firm foreign policy. Mike Pompeo and many of the folks, Matt Pottinger and others in the Trump administration really got this right. And I think if we signal weakness, we're actually hastening getting into a conflict, right? Because weakness gives the other side the feeling that they can do what they want. And so, no, we signal strength. And I think that is a whole lot less dangerous. And sometimes being a little bit unpredictable makes the world less dangerous. You never know what somebody's going to do. So I think with China, look, while many of us don't harbor any ill will toward the Chinese people, I think many of us are very concerned about the CCP, what it's doing, where it's going, and how it intends to eclipse the United States. And what's at stake isn't just semiconductors, and it isn't just interest rates. It's really our system. And I think in the world of narrative dominance, China is looking and telling the world, look at the Americans with endemic open-air drug markets, homelessness, political toxicity, and look at us. We are the world's stable partner. And so free markets and liberty, agency, personal liberty is under assault if China wins the narrative over what's the best form of government. That's really what's at stake here.
You're right. Well, Erik, I really appreciate you being here. I'm sure everyone watching does. I think that in a week or two, this will become a public link. But I'll close with, your views and then big picture about us projecting weakness are, they ring true back to history, all the way back to even the Munich Agreement of 1938, where the U.S. and France asked Czechoslovakia to cede some of Hitler's advances to him because Hitler promised not to keep advancing. And we know what happened. Again, appeasing dictators never, ever works. And we're doing so now. And Erik, I'm so glad that you're here fighting this fight with me and others. And I hope you continue to do so. And I hope that we get some new leadership that can stand up to some of these grave national security threats that we're facing today. But thanks for taking an hour of your time today to be with us, Erik.
You bet, Kyle. Thanks so much.
Right. We'll conclude there. Thanks everyone for listening to Real Vision, and look forward to our next interview.
Hey there, revolutionaries. To join a community sharing insights like you just watched, head over to realvision.com. There you will get unbiased insights and exclusive access to the very best, brightest, and biggest names in finance. Be a part of our community of lifelong learners. See you there.